Hello people of YouTube, my name is Pancake and welcome to my comic art channel. This channel is all about comic art and learning to get better, and that's what I aim to do. So this video, as you might have guessed, is all about hands. I've been on my own personal journey of learning and studying hands this past month, and I've accomplished over 500 different hands. So I'm going to try and boil all that knowledge down into this short video. It's quite comprehensive, so grab a sketchbook, feel free to pause, use the timestamps below, come back, study, and let me know how you get on. So where do we start with hands? For me, I start with the palm. And this may look like a sort of weird pentagon or something, or a squashed cube, but it's actually the base of the palm. So if I put my hand next to it, you can see that this slopes up to a point and comes back down. So do my fingers here. They slope to a point upwards to the middle finger and then go down. And then this goes from here down to here. Now this would represent going closer to the wrist because hands tend to pinch to a smaller point for the wrists. This is what these two mean. Obviously, if you've got a very big chunky hand, this may be wider. Or if you've got somebody who doesn't have such big hands as I do, then it may be slightly narrower. However, this is a perfect starting point as it's a very basic shape and works for most characters. So I'd sketch this and then we'll move on to step 2. So now we're on to step 2, which is drawing this basic shape in perspective. So the reason we do this is because not all hands that we're ever going to draw are going to be quite simple top down, like my hand here. They're going to be in all sorts of weird and wonderful perspectives like that. So I've drawn some examples here, and you're welcome to hit the pause button, draw these out for yourself, because I'm going to be using these for the very next step, which is how to put in the knuckles. So as you can see, some of these you might not initially be able to tell, well, which way is which, this one, like, well, what does that look like? Well, I will show you in the next step of where to put the knuckles and it'll all make a bit more sense to you. So, step 3, let's go. So now we're on to knuckles. And with knuckles, what I imagine that you're thinking is that we would start with circles. Full circles to designate where the knuckles are going to go. However, let me try and sell you on not using full circles. If we use full circles, it's going to make the page very messy. It's going to be full of lots of circles, especially if your hands are going to be very small. Instead, use curves, and this can be any proportion of a circle, but typically not a full circle. So what I've got here is I've got a copy of the sheet, and I don't want you to follow along with this part because you're just going to have to redo it anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you one with full circles and one without, in the way that I would do it, and then we'll talk about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose this one here for full circles. So this is the point of the hand. So I'm just going to do a full circle there. I'm going to do another full circle for the index finger, do a full circle for the ring finger, and another full circle for the pinky. And then for this one, which is similar, I'm just going to do what I would do normally, which is not full circles. So, hopefully this shows up on camera pretty well. Here you can see I've used full circles, and this, to me, in my mind, looks quite messy, and I'm not sure, I can't tell from this whether this shape is the palm or if it's the top of the hand, because the circles are full and it doesn't really tell me very much. This one, I can see that this knuckle sort of begins here and then wraps around this shape. So to me, in my mind, that looks like the top of the palm. So it would be sort of this sort of angle with the knuckles like that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to a quick time lapse where I'm going to do this full sheet of palms with this style, and we'll come back and talk about it. So I'm hoping so far that this is helpful, and so far it's at least a little bit interesting. Next step is step number 4, which is putting in the fingers. So let's go. So now we're on to step number 4, which we're actually going to be talking about fingers. So for fingers, I have 2 basic tips. Tip number 1 is, unless absolutely necessary, keep it to just 2 joints in the fingers. And this isn't a cheat, because plenty of professional comic artists, traditionalists, digital artists, they all do 2 joints if they can get away with it. The times that you can't get away with it is what I would say where the hands are in some sort of stress position. So that's either they're bending backwards, something like this, where you need to show all of the joints, or if they're bending forwards in some sort of grasp, clench, scratch, fist position, where you need to be able to show all joints. However, if they're just resting, if they're just chilling, you don't need to draw all of the joints. So I'm going to fill this page, and hopefully you've got the same page on your sketchbook, and then we're going to talk about the joints and whether you need 2 or 3. So as you can see, I hope that from these examples that I've drawn, you can see that you don't always have to use 3 joints. You can just use 2. And sometimes you can even just use 1 visible joint, and it gives the illusion of perspective. Next up is thumbs, so we can make these hands not look so daft. Alright, so let's talk about thumbs, and after this little section, you'll be able to draw full hands, which is quite exciting. So, to start a thumb, what you would do is you've got your palm placement, and you draw a chunky oval, which is the padded part of the hand. And then from this, the thumb can either be simplified into 2 joints. So if I hold my thumb up like this, you could have a joint there and a joint there. Or if I bring my thumb like this, you have a much more complicated shape, which is more like this. So this is why this part is in red, is this is the important part to think about. Like fingers, it can be simplified down to 2. Or if the thumb is in some sort of stress position like this is more stressful for my thumb to be in than a more chilled position, then you can simplify it from 2 if it's relaxed, or 3 if it's not. And these sort of bends is what will give your thumbs more energy. So it's more like a wave like that. So that is thumbs. So I'm going to use our sheet that we've been using. I'm going to time lapse through it. And if I think of anything to talk about afterwards, then I'll talk about it. And if not, we'll move on to the next step. Alright, so we're back with some thumbs on our example hands. So I did forget to mention in the earlier part that an easy way to sort of gauge proportion with thumbs is that it's typically, at least on my hand, it's just a little bit longer than the palm. These are all the tips I have for thumbs in the most basic sense of the word. Next up is hands in common resting positions with examples from comic books. So we're at the end of the basic section. This is very exciting. And here I've sketched out some of the most common hand poses that I've found in comics. It's split into 2 different sections. The top one is the relaxed section, and this one is the more stressed position for hands. This one is by far the most common pose, followed by these 2. These 2 are interchangeable. And on the right hand side of this, I will put up all the images for these ones while I talk about them. And the reason that these ones are the most used is because when hands are relaxed, the tendons also relax. And it's very difficult to move one finger that isn't the index finger. So fingers tend to be grouped. And this is the most common grouping. And so if you're struggling for how to draw hands in a relaxed scene, you can use these, come back to these as like a little library. People typically are making fists when they're stressed, when they're angry. This is also used not just for pushing people away, but a stress position, where they're pushing themselves up, where they're angry. people will flay their hands out like this. So keep these ones in mind for more action-packed scenes. And next up, we're going to be talking more in depth about the not so basic things, so I hope that you're going to stick around and watch the rest. Tip number 1 of the not so basic is all about energy. That glorious word that everybody throws around, and you can't really put a finger on it, what that means. Well, if you look at this hand, it looks like a hand. It's passable as a hand, right? You'd recognize it as a hand. But would you say it has energy? I wouldn't. One simple tip is bend your fingers to give them energy. Fingers can bend. They're not always straight. This is quite a simple beginner problem that I see all the time. So, if you compare that one with this one, which one do you think looks like it has more energy? This one. And that's because the fingers are bent. So, tip number 1, bend your fingers for energy. So, tip number 2 is all about the webbing in between your fingers. As you can see on this example, there's not really much showing of a webbing between the fingers, whereas here it's stretched. So this is a common thing that I see a lot of people do, especially at the beginning of their art journey, is where they think that the fingers just go straight down to the knuckles. There is a little bit of webbing, and you can see it there hopefully, and see it there, that when the fingers are stretched, the fingers don't just go straight down to one another. There is this little bit of webbing. So tip number 2 is don't forget about the webbing. So this brings us to tip number 3 regarding energy. So as you can see here, it looks like a pretty ordinary fist. They could be angry, they could be tense, they might have something in their hand. Whereas with this, when people are angry, the energy goes down their hands into their arms. So if you can imagine a typical sort of memey old man shouting at the clouds, if they're just like, but if they're really angry, the hands actually bend on the wrist. So just keep that in mind. The energy travels down in a scene or a panel or whatever it is that you're drawing, and the hands are sort of the main focus of it. So say if a main character is holding something or grabbing something where both hands are doing basically the same thing, like here. It's okay. It looks okay. However, both hands are in the exact same position. So what we need to do is switch up one of the hands so it's not the exact same position. I'm just going to time-lapse through this and then we'll come back. And there we go. Now the hands aren't symmetrical, so it looks a lot more natural to our eyes, and therefore our storytelling will be a little bit better. So tip number 5 is all about wrinkles, and you'll notice that there's no paper because this is very simple and I don't need to necessarily draw it out. So if you look at my hand, you might expect that these palm wrinkles, I guess, you might be tempted to draw them straight. However, they're never straight. They've always got some sort of bend, and they're typically more diagonal than they are horizontal. So tip number 1 regarding wrinkles is make your palm wrinkles bendy. Onwards to the next tip regarding palms. So if I bring my hand closer together in a fist, and if we had a shot like this, you might forget to draw these little creases. And it's really important that you do actually draw them because it shows so much tension. So if you're ever drawing a fist from this angle, remember, little creases are good in the hand. So the next tip about wrinkles is to do with knuckles. And I'm hoping you can see quite clearly on my knuckles. These little wrinkles on the joints, they're not straight. They're actually bent. And they bend around the knuckle. So that they're very rarely just straight up. So here I've drawn some bent knuckle lines. And then on these ones, I've drawn straight ones, so you can sort of compare how sort of odd it looks. And just a note, here I actually made a mistake because I bent the knuckle the wrong way, so that to me just looks really odd, because these ones are all bent that way, but that one's actually bent the other way, like underbend. So that's another tip, I guess, by accident. So this is all about fists, and this fist here is one that I've drawn using all the tips I'm about to give you. And this one is one that I imagine all of us have drawn at some point in our artistic journey. We've created our own fist and we've drawn it just like this, and we think, oh yeah, that looks just like a fist, so that'll do. So, tip number 1 is that symmetry is boring. So, what we need to do is, I always try and raise the index finger a little bit to separate it from the rest of the fingers. So, the second tip is to move all of your fingers into a more slanted direction like this, rather than having it boring like that. So if you can do that, and one of them is always going to be raised at the top, so that again looks fabulous. From our earlier tips, if we can bring that wrist up or back, and then if we do that, we can show lots of tendons, because we're going to be putting our wrists into a strained position. With the tendons as well, if it's from the top, you would also have tendons going down from the knuckles, and this would be directly adjoined to the middle of the knuckle. On mine, it's probably not too visible because A, I'm super pale, and B, I guess my fat percentage isn't that low. The next tip I have for fists is to give your fists little tiny butt cracks. And what I mean by this is, when fists are like this, and when they're in a stressed position, you get these little creases, and these little creases point up towards the index finger. So if you can give your fist a little butt crack in each of these shapes here, you're good to go. My next set of tips are going to be all about perspective, and particularly extreme perspective. So this may look like sort of like a normal pose, where there's going to be some sort of foreshortening with this person's hand. And if you're like me, you might be tempted to start drawing the arm and the shoulder first, and then eventually get into the hand and trying to work yourself back to front with foreshortening. However, give it a go where you draw your palm box first and then attach your arm to it. So I'm going to give it a go, and we'll see how it goes. So that's what I've accomplished in possibly approximately less than a minute. And if I'd done that the other way, where I drew the arm and then tried to come forward, I can guarantee I wouldn't have got to this point as quick. So try and draw front to back when it comes to hands. So continuing on with extreme perspective in hands. This hand absolutely perplexed me. I was like, I don't know how he did that. So what I did was I created my palm box, like we all know now. I started with the palm box and then the fingertips as ovals, and that gave me a guideline on how to join them together. So that's David's, and this is my one from January, 31st of January this year. And you can see that this is where I'd put in my guides. So that's it. That's everything that I've got to say about hands currently, as of nearly the end of March 2024. You know, it's always a journey, and I can imagine there's a lot more that I need to learn about hands. So if you have anything that you've learned that I feel like that you feel like I should learn about hands, please let me know down in the comments below. If you found this useful, please let me know. If there's anything that you think that I should do differently, or if you have any feedback, I'm totally open to that. Otherwise, just, you know, do the usual, hit the like, comment, subscribe if you feel like it.